Hey guys, tonight we begin with the far steamier chronicles of medieval bedrooms, where chastity belts were theoretical and reputations were optional. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's talk about Edward II, King of England, patron of architecture, disastrous military leader, and man so famously uninterested in his wife that medieval chroniclers started getting suspicious. Now, we're not here to speculate. We're here to present what everyone else at the time was loudly whispering about. And the whispers were mostly along the lines of, "You seen him and Piers Gaveston lately?" And Piers Gaveston was Edward's favourite. Not like, "he's a loyal advisor" favourite. More like, "Here, take this earldom, my crown jewels, and half the royal treasury" favourite. He dressed better than the Queen, danced harder at parties, and had his own entourage, while Isabella of France, Edward's actual wife, sat there like a forgotten side quest. Edward gave Piers lands, titles, and what historians have politely called conspicuous affection. The barons hated it. Isabella hated it. Honestly, everyone but Edward hated it. And when the nobles finally got fed up and exiled Gaveston, Edward brought him back faster than a teenager unblocking their ex. This happened multiple times. Eventually they murdered Gaveston, brutally. And you can bet that didn't go over well. Edward didn't exactly learn subtlety. He replaced Gaveston with Hugh Despenser the Younger, another clingy favourite, who quickly achieved unbearable status among the nobility. Same formula: gifts, titles, cuddles, nationwide resentment. Meanwhile, England was falling apart, Scotland was winning wars, and Edward was busy playing favourites with men who wore more jewellery than their mistresses. His wife, Isabella, not one to be ignored forever, teamed up with her lover Roger Mortimer, invaded England, and overthrew him. They imprisoned Edward and, well, here's where it gets spicy, in a way no one asked for. The rumour, widely repeated by chroniclers who clearly loved drama, is that he was executed by having a red-hot poker inserted where the sun did not shine. No historical confirmation, but the tale stuck, possibly because it felt narratively tidy. In the end, Edward wasn't just known for being a bad king. He became medieval history's cautionary tale about mixing politics with intense public affection, and not reading the room, or the barons, or your very angry wife. If medieval Europe had a celebrity A-lister, it was Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France, Queen of England, patron of poets, mother of kings, and, most importantly for tonight's theme, a woman who lived like the troubadours she funded, with flair, passion, and the occasional scandal that left bishops reaching for their smelling salts. Born around 1122, Eleanor didn't just marry into power. She dragged it home by the beard. She first wed Louis VII of France, a king so pious he probably apologised to candles before blowing them out. Eleanor, on the other hand, liked lively court life, spicy poetry, and men who didn't spend half their time on crusade trying to outpray each other. Their marriage? Awkward at best. While Louis was out crusading, Eleanor allegedly entertained her own ambitions. Rumours swirled about her close friendship with her uncle Raymond of Poitiers. And let's just say medieval chroniclers weren't known for their subtlety. Was there something romantic there? Maybe. Was it enough to make Louis jealous and furious? Definitely. Eventually, the Pope agreed to an annulment, citing consanguinity, which is medieval church code for your cousins, and also this is getting weird. Eleanor, newly single and scandalously empowered, wasted zero time. On her way home, she was nearly kidnapped twice, not for ransom, but for marriage. That's how much of a catch she was. She ended up marrying Henry Plantagenet, the future King Henry II of England. Their union was passionate, political, and eventually a bit stabby. She bore him 8 children, including Richard the Lionheart and John, who would go on to write the Magna Carta by accident, but things soured. Eleanor eventually backed her sons in a rebellion against Henry. When she wasn't leading revolts, she was running her own court in Poitiers, filled with troubadours, rules of courtly love, and the kind of storytelling that would make Netflix blush. To put it mildly, Eleanor had suitors, secrets, and stamina. She wasn't just admired, she was feared, desired, and occasionally excommunicated. If body count included power moves, emotional casualties, and rejected knights who wrote sad poems about her for decades, Eleanor of Aquitaine was undefeated. She lived into her 80s, and by the time she died, she had outlived 2 kings, birthed an empire, and left behind enough rumours to fuel a dozen HBO miniseries. In the long, morally complex annals of papal history, few figures managed to be simultaneously the head of the Catholic Church and the most committed participant in Roman bedroom bingo. Enter Rodrigo Borgia, better known as Pope Alexander VI, spiritual shepherd by day, party animal by candlelight. Elected Pope in 1492, Rodrigo wasn't exactly what you'd call subtle. While previous popes tried to keep their affairs under wraps, or at least under tapestries, Alexander said, "What if I didn't?" and proceeded to turn the Vatican into something resembling a high-budget Renaissance soap opera. He had mistresses, children, and favourite cardinals, many of whom shared his last name, because yes, nepotism was basically family tradition. His most famous mistress was Vanozza dei Catane, with whom he had several children before he became pope, and kept close after. Then came Giulia Farnese, known in Roman gossip circles as the Pope's bride. Subtle. Among his children were Cesare Borgia, who inspired Machiavelli's The Prince, and Lucrezia Borgia, who inspired every rumour involving poison rings, incest, and medieval mean girl tactics. Were all of those true? Historians say probably not, but did people want them to be true? Absolutely. Alexander's Vatican was filled with art, corruption, wine, feasts, and what some chroniclers delicately called excessive merriment. At one infamous banquet, the Banquet of Chestnuts, guests claimed that dozens of courtesans crawled across the papal floor collecting chestnuts, while clerics judged their agility. No word on the scorecards. And through all of this, Alexander kept his position, smiling, scheming, and occasionally blessing people with the same hands he used to sign off on bribes. His enemies were many, but his influence was greater. He was charming, cunning, and utterly unbothered by the contradiction of running the church like a feudal nightclub. In the end, Pope Alexander died the way he lived, dramatically. Possibly poisoned, possibly by accident, possibly while trying to poison someone else. It's a mystery wrapped in a cassock, drenched in wine, and sprinkled with questionable decisions. If holiness was measured by restraint, Alexander VI would be disqualified. But if the Vatican had a leaderboard for body count, oh, he'd be wearing the tiara and holding the trophy. If medieval Poland ever had a monarch who made his royal court look like the set of a chaotic reality dating show, it was Władysław II Jagiełło. Now don't confuse him with your average love-struck royal. This man didn't just fall for a lady here or there, he fell for entire categories of women, and apparently thought the state treasury existed to support his collection. Władysław II, King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, came to power in the late 14th century and ruled for over 4 decades. Politically, he was quite accomplished. He converted Lithuania to Christianity, forged alliances, and oversaw a dynasty. But romantically, that's where the budget started bleeding. To be fair, he married well. His 4 wives were politically strategic, but beyond the chapel, Władysław seemed to have no off-switch. He collected mistresses like some people collect stamps, except stamps don't require dowries, manners, titles, and elaborate fur-lined dresses. By the time he hit his 60s, in an era where most men didn't survive a strong breeze, he was still going strong. One chronicle even mentions that his vigour was unmatched, which is medieval code for he kept the royal bed constantly occupied. His court documents actually list dozens of expenditures labelled gifts for the lady, and no one had the courage to ask which lady. Local nobles started grumbling. Wars, funded, roads, Maybe. But Blonde in Tower 3 just got a ruby necklace and a new winter cottage. It got so bad that by the end of his reign, the kingdom's finances were held together with wishful thinking and delayed payments. He once borrowed money from the church, not for crusades or cathedrals, but to throw a royal ball, likely featuring his entire dating roster. And yet, the people still respected him, partly because he won battles and partly because, well, how do you stay mad at a guy who's broke from buying too many girlfriends matching ponies? In the end, Vladislaus died in bed, shockingly of old age, not exhaustion. His legacy lives on in Polish history, and probably in the financial ledgers marked miscellaneous lady expenses. Before Beyoncé, before Marilyn, before even Eleanor of Aquitaine, there was Theodora, the Byzantine bombshell who went from performing slightly raunchy stage shows to ruling the Eastern Roman Empire. And somehow, she managed to do it all without ever officially inventing a hashtag. Born around 500 CE, Theodora's early resume included a stint as an actress, which in 6th century Constantinople was less Shakespeare in the Park and more lightly veiled striptease with a historical theme. Contemporary historian Procopius, who clearly had feelings, described one of her performances involving geese, stage props, and very questionable metaphors. We'll leave it at that, mostly because we're trying to keep this video from getting demonetized. But here's the twist. Theodora wasn't just dazzling audiences. She was smart, shrewd, and possibly the only person in history who successfully used burlesque to enter politics. Somewhere along the line, she caught the eye of Justinian, heir to the imperial throne. He saw past her, well, theatrical resume, and instead admired her intellect. And maybe her ability to dominate a room without technically holding office. They married, but not before Justinian changed the law so he could marry a woman of her station, which tells you just how much Theodora broke the mold. Once empress, she dropped the feather boas and picked up legal reforms. She passed laws protecting women from trafficking, gave actresses more rights, and even worked on marriage protections. Basically, she turned the palace into a legislative engine, with just the occasional side-eye from the church. Her most iconic moment? The Nika riots of 532, when angry mobs nearly toppled the throne. Justinian wanted to flee. Theodora allegedly stared him down and said, "Purple makes a fine burial shroud." Translation, we die as emperors, or we don't die at all. He stayed. The riots were crushed. The empire was saved by the former Goose Theatre girl. She died relatively young, at around 48. But Theodora's legacy is immortal. A scandalous start, a revolutionary reign, and a middle finger to every nobleman who said she'd never be more than a pretty face. Spoiler, she became Empress of the East. If you've ever wondered how far royal multitasking can go, look no further than Charles II of Naples. A man who somehow managed to collect a hilariously excessive number of children, while juggling more titles than a medieval business card. Charles, who ruled Naples from 1285 to 1309, was supposed to be a pious, strategic ruler, and on paper, he was. He helped solidify Angevin control in southern Italy, wore a crown or three, and even hosted the occasional crusade-adjacent conversation. But when he wasn't busy signing treaties or pretending Sicily wasn't a flaming disaster, he was apparently very busy in other areas. Let's start with the family tree, which looks less like a royal lineage and more like a hedge with no pruning. Official records list around 14 children with his wife, Mary of Hungary, which was already a medieval flex. But then came the rumoured mistresses, and their children, and the courtiers pretending they didn't notice. How many illegitimate children? Historians disagree, mostly because medieval scribes eventually gave up and switched to broad estimates. One Italian chronicler allegedly wrote, "More than the stars on a clear night." That's not history. That's astronomy fueled by exhaustion. What's clear is that Charles had a habit of nobling his unofficial offspring. Some got land, some got abbeys. A few were quietly shipped off to monasteries, where they could reflect on how awkward family reunions would have been. Others were even married off to distant cousins, ensuring the bloodline stayed complicated and the inheritance battles stayed spicy. The church naturally raised an eyebrow, but Charles was clever. He funded religious buildings and crusades just enough to keep his image holy, even if his private life was more biblical in the begetting sense. What's impressive isn't just the quantity of his romantic entanglements, it's how he managed to remember all of them. The man was basically the medieval version of a group chat with 40 unread messages titled, "My Kids, Maybe." By the time he died, Charles had fathered a kingdom, a dozen political alliances, and enough children to start a very confused dynasty. His tomb reads, King of Naples and Jerusalem. It should probably also say, Employee of the Month, Department of Reproduction. If there were a medieval reality show titled Queens Who Snapped, Isabella of France would have earned the pilot episode, the spin-off, and probably a Netflix documentary. Born in 1295 to King Philip the Fair of France, she was destined for royal entanglements. Unfortunately, she was married off to Edward II of England, a man who famously preferred other company. And by company, we mean a guy named Piers Gaveston, whose influence was so strong he practically needed his own crown. For years, Isabella smiled through the royal awkwardness. She gave Edward airs, wore the gowns, played the part. Meanwhile, Edward gave most of his attention, and a disturbingly large chunk of royal treasure, to his favourites. If you're wondering how that marriage survived as long as it did, the answer is medieval Catholic guilt and a complete lack of divorce lawyers. Eventually, Isabella had enough. She returned to France, gathered support, and a lover named Roger Mortimer, whose resume included handsome rebel, and started plotting. Her next move? She invaded England. Yes, invaded. With mercenaries, with her lover, and with the righteous fury of a woman who had sat through one too many dinners with her husband's boyfriend at the table. The coup was swift and decisive. Edward was deposed, imprisoned, and according to some spicy rumours, murdered in a manner not safe for medieval dinner conversation. Mortimer basically ruled England through Isabella for a while, and for a brief moment in history, the English crown was effectively run by a French woman and her hot boyfriend, which feels like an elaborate revenge plot, even by modern standards. Of course, power went to their heads. They spent like there was no tomorrow, made enemies of everyone, and eventually got caught by Isabella's teenage son, Edward III, who apparently decided, enough of Mum's villain era. Mortimer was executed. Isabella was sent to luxurious confinement, not quite prison, but no more royal balls either. Still, Isabella's legacy is undeniable. A queen who turned humiliation into invasion and passion into power. And while England never quite forgave her, historians can't help but admire the sheer audacity of it all. Before there was The Bachelor, there was Henry I of England, except instead of roses, he handed out titles, land, and the occasional awkward family reunion. Born in 1068 as the youngest son of William the Conqueror, Henry didn't inherit the crown. He took it after his brother died in a mysterious hunting accident, which, in medieval terms, means he was probably just the better archer that day. But if Henry was ruthless on the battlefield, he was even more prolific in the bedroom. And by prolific, we mean over 20 mistresses and at least 24 illegitimate children. That's not a king. That's a human fertility festival. Unlike other monarchs who tried to keep their extracurriculars hush-hush, Henry I made no such effort. He acknowledged most of his children, gave them noble marriages, and even brought a few into politics. He was basically running a build-a-bastard workshop, and business was booming. The mistresses came from all walks of life. Noblewomen, commoners, possibly the occasional tavern waitress who made strong eye contact. Henry didn't discriminate. If you could bat an eyelash and pronounce sire correctly, you were halfway to a cottage and a child support stipend. And what about the Queen, you ask? Matilda of Scotland. A respectable woman. Probably had a permanent eye twitch. She gave him 2 legitimate children and then watched as Henry's extended family required a royal flowchart. One of his most famous illegitimate daughters, Sybil, married a prominent noble. Another, Matilda Fitzroy, became an abbess, which feels like the medieval version of putting your phone on airplane mode to avoid family drama. To his credit, Henry wasn't just sowing oats and calling it leadership. He centralised power, reformed the justice system, and laid the groundwork for English common law. But those reforms had to share desk space with baby announcements and uncomfortable family banquets. When he died in 1135, after eating a surfeit of lampreys, which is history speak for fish overdose, England plunged into a succession crisis. Why? Because his only surviving legitimate son had died years earlier. 24 children and not one could legally inherit the crown. That's almost impressive. Henry I, father of a nation, and half the nobility. If you thought medieval queens lived quiet lives embroidering tapestries and politely ignoring their husbands, meet Joanna of Naples, a woman who burned through 4 husbands, suffocated a lover, allegedly, and ran a kingdom like it was her personal drama stage. Born in 1328, Joanna was crowned Queen of Naples at just 16. Her first husband was Andrew of Hungary, who expected to be king. Unfortunately, so did Joanna, and one of them had a more committed fan base. In 1345, Andrew was found hanging from a balcony after a hunting accident in which the only thing hunted was Andrew. Rumours swirled that Joanna either approved the hit or personally fluffed the pillow. Either way, the message was clear. Do not assume things, especially crowns. She wasted no time mourning. In fact, she remarried almost immediately to Louis of Taranto, who, unlike Andrew, seemed content letting Joanna call the shots, both in politics and, presumably, in bed. Their relationship was passionate and tumultuous, which is medieval code for they probably threw furniture during arguments. After Louis came James IV of Majorca, who had about as much power as a decorative plant. And last but not least, Otto of Brunswick, whose name alone sounds like a backup night in a tavern brawl, not a royal consort. Joanna clearly had a type, ambitious but not too ambitious, or at least easy to unseat. Meanwhile, Joanna had to deal with rival claims to her throne, invasions, excommunication, because the Pope didn't approve of her love life or her politics, or maybe he just couldn't keep up, and constant palace intrigue. Through it all, she remained fiercely in control. People whispered, chronicles judged. Joanna, unfazed, kept ruling and kept marrying. She may not have invented the phrase, next, but she certainly lived it. Eventually, her enemies caught up. In 1382, Charles of Durazzo invaded Naples, imprisoned Joanna, and, in true medieval overreaction, had her strangled. Possibly with a pillow, possibly as ironic punishment. But history hasn't forgotten her. Joanna of Naples. Too bold for her era, too many husbands for the church, and absolutely no regrets. When you're officially titled the Bad, you've either committed an alarming number of medieval crimes, or you really ticked off the chroniclers. In the case of Charles II of Navarre, it was probably both. Born in 1332, Charles inherited the Kingdom of Navarre, a tiny kingdom nestled between France and Spain, and decided that simply being king wasn't spicy enough. So he dabbled in murder, treason, lies, affairs, more affairs, and possibly inventing the medieval version of ghosting. His political resume reads like a do-not-date list with bloodstains. Let's start with his romantic exploits, which were less courtly love and more court-mandated chaos. Charles reportedly had mistresses in nearly every region he visited. Some nobles tried to keep mistresses discreet. Charles had a touring schedule. He seduced noblewomen, married women, widows, basically anyone with a pulse and poor judgment. In one scandal, he allegedly slept with a married lady and then arranged her husband's assassination. Medieval solutions, people. But Charles wasn't just bad in bed, he was bad everywhere. He played France and England against each other during the 100 Years' War, like a high-stakes Tinder game, switching alliances more often than he changed tunics. One week he was brokering peace. The next, he was assassinating French officials and denying it with the medieval equivalent of new phone, who dis. His nickname, the Bad, wasn't a PR mishap. It was earned through bribery, betrayal, poisoning attempts, and at least one confirmed torture dungeon. He was accused of plotting to poison Charles V of France, twice. When called out, he simply denied it with a smirk, which is also how he answered questions about his ever-growing list of mistresses and fatherless nobles. Eventually, karma arrived wearing a monk's robe. In 1387, Charles fell ill and was wrapped in brandy-soaked linen as a remedy. A servant tried to cut the cloth with a candle and accidentally set him on fire. Yes, he died by spontaneous human flambé, a fitting end for a man whose life was a walking scandal. Charles II of Navarre, part king, part chaos goblin, and wholly deserving of his unfortunate nickname. When your rebound relationship accidentally starts a civil war and also births a new royal dynasty, you might be Catherine of Valois, or at least someone who really needs to stop dating younger men with swords. Born in 1401 to King Charles VI of France, who was mentally unwell and thought he was made of glass, Catherine's early years were already off to a wonderfully stable start. As a princess, she was politically valuable and emotionally neglected, the perfect combination for, let's marry her off to the enemy and see what happens. That enemy was Henry V of England, war hero, Shakespearean icon, and definitely not the guy to bring home to a French dinner party. They married in 1420 to seal the whole Treaty of Troyes thing, which basically told the Dauphin of France to go cry into his baguette. Catherine dutifully followed Henry to England and gave birth to Henry VI, before Henry promptly died of dysentery. Romantic, isn't it? Now a widow in her early 20s, Catherine found herself alone, still French, and somehow Queen of England. What's a lonely, politically sidelined young royal to do? Apparently, fall in love with a handsome Welsh servant named Owen Tudor, whose resume included courtier and shirtless in the garden probably. Their relationship was discreet, which in royal terms means everyone knew but pretended not to. They secretly married, or maybe didn't, historians still argue, and had several children, including Edmund Tudor, whose son would go on to become Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. So yes, Catherine of Valois literally birthed the Tudors. That's like starting a one-night stand and accidentally founding HBO's favourite historical soap opera. Of course, once the truth came out, England was scandalised. Parliament had passed a law saying Catherine needed permission to remarry, and she had gone off and done it anyway. The court was shocked, the nobles were outraged, and Catherine, probably sitting in a tower somewhere thinking, worth it. So next time someone says, you're moving on too fast, just remember, Catherine of Valois did it with a younger man, birthed a dynasty, and changed the course of history. No pressure. Let's start with a warning. This one's not funny. It's historical cringe funny, because Gilles de Rais was both a celebrated knight and a medieval nightmare. Imagine if George Washington turned out to be Buffalo Bill, and you're halfway there. Born in 1405 to a noble Breton family, Gilles was the medieval equivalent of rich, hot, and connected. He inherited enormous wealth as a teenager, and rose through the ranks as a brilliant military commander, fighting alongside none other than Joan of Arc. Yes, that Joan. For a time, he was one of France's most admired war heroes, the kind of guy you'd name your sword after. But after the war ended, and Joan was famously barbecued by the English, Gilles had a bit of an existential spiral. Most nobles would turn to prayer, politics, or poetry. Gilles turned to alchemical experiments, demonic summoning, and murdering children. Yes, you read that right. From around 1432 to 1440, Gilles de Rais lured in hundreds of peasant children, promising jobs, choir positions, or safe shelter, and then tortured and killed them in what can only be described as medieval horror movie rituals. He didn't just murder them, he ritually dismembered them, often while reciting incantations or demanding demonic favours. Gilles, you see, believed he could unlock hidden knowledge, or gold, by offering the worst bribes imaginable. But here's the baffling part. For years, no one did anything. Because Gilles was a war hero. He built chapels, he funded passion plays, he even had his own fan base. It wasn't until he ran out of money and started selling off church relics and threatening bishops that the church finally decided, Okay, maybe we investigate now. His trial in 1440 was a spectacle. Hundreds of testimonies, graphic confessions. Even Gilles himself eventually broke down, admitting everything, with a theatrical flair that probably earned him a standing ovation in hell. He was executed by hanging and burning, a rare 2-for-1 special, usually reserved for those who really ticked off the church. So yes, Gilles de Rais was popular, and then he was infamous. And now he's a historical warning about giving too many free passes to national heroes with weird basements. Once upon a French court, in the 15th century, a woman walked in, exposed one breast, and somehow became the standard of royal fashion. This was Agnès Sorel, and she wasn't here to play coy. She was here to redefine monarchy. From the side of the bed. Born around 1422 into minor nobility, Agnès was sent to court in her late teens, where she did what every ambitious medieval woman did. Survive, look flawless, and avoid open windows during political scandals. She began as a lady-in-waiting, which basically meant being close enough to power to smell it. And in this case, close enough for King Charles VII of France to notice her and think, well, she seems like good governance material. Charles, still emotionally bruised from the 100 Years' War, and being the guy Joan of Arc had to babysit into action, was deeply taken with Agnès. And rather than sneak around like every other king with impulse control issues, he just made it official. Agnès Sorel became the first woman in French history to be declared the official royal mistress, like being promoted from office fling to salaried chaos. Agnès leaned into her role with the energy of a woman who knew she was both untouchable and magnetic. She influenced court fashion, appearing in gowns with strategically absent fabric, making the boob window a political statement. Monks preached sermons about it, nobles copied it, and the king? He built her a manor. More than eye candy, Agnès was also a political advisor of sorts, whispering into Charles's ear, allegedly encouraging him to stop sulking and start governing again. Some even credited her with pulling the king out of a long depressive fog, essentially therapist with cleavage. She bore him 4 daughters, dabbled in diplomacy, and then, in true medieval fashion, died mysteriously at age 28, possibly poisoned by political rivals who found her too influential, or maybe just from mercury prescribed for parasites. Because medieval medicine, always either dirt or deadly. Her legacy? A new courtly role, massive portraits with strategic nudity, and centuries of imitators trying to balance seduction with statecraft. Agnès proved that being the other woman could make you the main character. In fashion, in power, and in history books written by men who probably needed cold showers. Ah yes, the Tour de Nesle affair, where political intrigue met medieval pillow talk and made the French monarchy look like it was run by teenagers with no impulse control. Let's set the scene. It's the early 1300s. France is ruled by Philip IV, a king so serious he was nicknamed Philip the Fair, not for his justice, but for his cheekbones. He had 3 sons, and they all got married in what was supposed to be a diplomatic hat-trick of dynastic consolidation. One of those brides was Margaret of Burgundy, married to Louis, future king, and part-time medieval himbo. Margaret, like many medieval noblewomen, probably expected a dull life of embroidery, childbearing, and pretending not to notice her husband flirting with the staff. But Margaret had ambitions. She wasn't content with playing queen-in-waiting. She wanted something a bit more thrilling. Enter the Tour de Nesle, a small tower along the Seine that, according to legend, and a lot of gossip, became the secret hookup spot for Margaret and her 2 royal sisters-in-law. Their alleged partners? 2 brothers from a lesser noble family who, unfortunately for them, weren't very discreet. They were seen accepting lavish gifts, like embroidered purses, that happened to be traced back to the princesses. Philip IV, upon learning that his daughters-in-law were playing medieval spin the bottle with the help, launched a full-blown investigation. Torture was used, because of course, and the affair blew up bigger than a French battlefield. The 2 brothers were publicly flayed alive and hanged by their armpits. Margaret and her partners in crime were locked in prison, their reputations forever toast. Margaret got the worst of it. She was kept in harsh, solitary confinement, in a freezing tower where even royal blood couldn't buy her a decent blanket. She died a few years later, possibly strangled on royal orders, or possibly from sheer scandal fatigue. The kicker: this salacious scandal helped end the Capetian dynasty. None of the three sons managed to produce a legitimate male heir, leading to the 100 Years' War and the rise of the Valois. If medieval kings were rated on their ability to wage war and make heirs, Alfonso XI of Castile would be considered an absolute menace. Born in 1311 and crowned at age 1, because Castile was really into speed-running monarchies, Alfonso quickly proved two things. He could win battles, and he could fill cradles. Repeatedly. Let's start with the king stuff. Alfonso was a competent ruler who spent most of his career fighting Moors, rival nobles, and boredom, the trifecta of medieval Castilian life. He won the famous Battle of Rio Salado in 1340, pushing back the Marinid invasion and earning himself a shiny reputation as a Christian hero. You'd think that sort of achievement would satisfy a man. It did not. Alfonso also made it his business, literally, to repopulate the nobility. And unlike other kings who snuck around with their mistresses, Alfonso proudly paraded his favourite, Leonor de Guzman, like she was a court-appointed concubine with benefits. He had 10 children with her. That's not a side hustle. That's a whole department. Meanwhile, his actual wife, Maria of Portugal, was understandably not thrilled. She was supposed to be the queen, not the background character in her own marriage. But Alfonso, in a masterclass of royal audacity, gave his mistress estates, titles, and more attention than the queen ever got. It was basically medieval polyamory with very poor communication. His court tried to intervene. They told him to cut ties with Leonor. Alfonso responded by ignoring them, and, likely, making another baby. Priorities. When the Black Death arrived in 1350, as it does in every medieval story just when things were getting spicy, Alfonso refused to cancel his siege of Gibraltar, because obviously, germs feared determination. Spoiler: they did not. Alfonso died of the plague, leaving behind a war, a power vacuum, and more illegitimate children than royal advisors could count without an abacus. But the drama didn't end there. Maria, the neglected queen, outlived him and immediately had Leonor imprisoned and executed. The mistress may have had his heart and half his DNA, but the queen got the last word. Alfonso XI, military hero, fertility icon, and cautionary tale for anyone considering workplace romance on a kingdom-wide scale. High in the rugged folds of Mount Parnassus, Delphi stood as more than just a town. To the Greeks, it was the very navel of the world. Legend told that Zeus, to find the Earth's centre, released two eagles from opposite ends of the sky. Where they crossed paths, a stone was placed, the omphalos, the navel stone. That stone rested at Delphi, and from that point, all directions of the earth were said to stretch outward. For the pilgrims who made the journey, there was no mistaking the weight of this place. It was not simply stone and mountain. It was destiny carved into the landscape. At the heart of Delphi stood the Temple of Apollo, a gleaming structure of white marble that caught the sunlight like fire. Columns rose proudly, etched with carvings that spoke of both myth and memory. Yet what gave the temple its true power lay not in its architecture, but in what pulsed beneath it. Cracks in the earth released strange vapours, subtle but intoxicating. To the ancient mind, these were no ordinary fumes. They were the breath of the god himself, the doorway between the human and the divine. Travellers from every corner of Greece and beyond came here. Kings arrived with sacrifices, their treasuries heavy with gold and ivory, seeking favour for wars they had yet to fight. Philosophers and poets carried questions about the nature of life, truth, and fate. Farmers, worn by drought or loss, climbed the mountain steps praying for guidance. Each believed the same thing, that within these walls the voice of Apollo could be heard, not in thunder or fire, but through the quiet, cryptic words of a woman, the Oracle. The setting of Delphi was carefully designed to remind the visitor of their smallness. The path to the temple wound upward, a deliberate climb meant to strip the visitor of pride with each step. On the way, one would pass treasuries built by rival city-states, monuments to victories won, and inscriptions carved into stone that whispered warnings such as, "Know thyself, and nothing in excess." By the time a pilgrim reached the temple gates, they had already been humbled by both earth and stone, ready to hear truths that could change the course of lives, or even the course of history. Here, at the world's sacred center, the Oracle of Delphi awaited. The woman who would become the Oracle of Delphi was not chosen by accident. Known as the Pythia, she was selected with care from among the women of Delphi. She was usually older, past childbearing age, and of unquestioned moral standing. Her life before the temple might have been that of a wife, a mother, or a simple villager. But once chosen, her world changed forever. From that day forward, she ceased to belong to her household or her kin. She became the voice of Apollo, the living bridge between gods and mortals. The transformation into Pythia was not immediate. It began with purification. Before she could even step into the sacred chamber, she bathed in the Castalian spring, whose waters gushed cold and clear at the foot of the mountain. This act symbolized the cleansing of all worldly ties, washing away her past and preparing her for the divine. Afterward, she donned a simple white robe, a crown of laurel leaves upon her head, the tree sacred to Apollo himself. Inside the temple, the Pythia's seat was no throne of gold, but a humble tripod set above the fissures that released the earth's mysterious vapours. There she would sit, clutching a laurel branch in one hand and a bowl of spring water in the other. The atmosphere was heavy, sweet incense, dim light, the echo of hymns sung by temple priests. It was here that the transformation happened. When the vapours rose, the Pythia entered a trance, her breath becoming shallow, her body trembling as if the god himself had stepped inside her. To the waiting world, she was no longer a mortal woman. She was Apollo speaking through flesh. Her voice, often described as fragmented, muttering, or even raving, was then carefully interpreted by priests. The raw utterances were polished into verse, most often into hexameter, the rhythmic language of prophecy. Kings and generals would bow before her, waiting for answers that could determine the fate of nations. Becoming the Pythia meant giving up the ordinary life of a Greek woman, but it also meant achieving a kind of immortality. For centuries, her words would be remembered, argued over, and feared. She was not merely speaking to one man or one city, but to history itself. And as her prophecies spread across the Greek world, her role as the most powerful woman in antiquity only grew stronger. Word of the oracle's power spread quickly beyond Delphi. At first, she was the voice of Apollo for nearby villages and city-states, but soon her fame stretched across the Mediterranean. Kings from foreign lands, generals commanding armies, and envoys bearing gifts all made the long journey to the slopes of Mount Parnassus. What made the oracle so extraordinary was not just her ability to answer questions, but the nature of those answers. She spoke in riddles, cryptic, layered, and open to interpretation. In this ambiguity lay her strength. For no matter the outcome, her words always seemed to prove true. One of her earliest legendary prophecies came when Croesus, the wealthy king of Lydia, sought guidance before waging war against Persia. He asked if he should attack, and the oracle replied that if he crossed the river Halys, he would destroy a mighty empire. Encouraged, Croesus went to war, only to lose his kingdom. The prophecy had been correct, yet devastating. His empire had indeed been destroyed, his own. Stories like these cemented the oracle's reputation as a force beyond manipulation, a divine voice immune to the ambitions of mortals. Her influence was not confined to war. Philosophers and poets came seeking wisdom on the mysteries of life and the gods. It was at Delphi that Socrates was declared the wisest man in Greece, not because he knew everything, but because he knew nothing. This single pronouncement shaped the path of Western philosophy. Imagine the ripple effect, centuries of thought, debate, and learning, all traced back to a single answer uttered in Apollo's temple. Even city-states consulted her before founding colonies or building laws. When the Spartans prepared for battle, they asked for her blessing. When Athens debated democracy, her words were weighed alongside the votes of men. Her authority was such that leaders often built entire strategies and systems of belief around what she declared. The Oracle did not just predict the future, she helped create it. In an age when women rarely held positions of power, the Pythia of Delphi stood apart. Cloaked in divine mystery, she could sway the course of history with a single phrase. To question her was to question Apollo himself, and few dared take that risk. By the 6th century BCE, the Oracle was no longer a local curiosity. She had become the beating heart of Greek religion, politics, and philosophy. The Oracle of Delphi did not simply appear before petitioners and speak. Every prophecy was wrapped in layers of ritual, each designed to remind mortals that they stood on sacred ground at the threshold of the divine. From the moment a pilgrim arrived in Delphi, the process began, not with words, but with offerings. To even approach Apollo's temple, a sacrifice had to be made. A goat, sprinkled with cold water, was observed carefully. If it shivered, the sign was favourable. Only then could the petitioner proceed. The supplicant would bring gifts, golden statues, bowls of silver, even entire treasuries dedicated by city-states. These were stored in small buildings lining the sacred way, monuments to human devotion and rivalry. Walking past them was a deliberate act. Every step toward the temple reminded the seeker of Apollo's power and of their own vulnerability. Before entering the inner sanctum, the petitioner underwent purification at the Castalian spring. Cold water washed their face and hands, cleansing them of impurity. The priests, too, prepared with chants and incense, their voices echoing against marble walls. It was a performance both spiritual and theatrical, meant to heighten expectation. By the time the supplicant was brought before the oracle, they were already primed to receive the god's voice. The Pythia herself began with her own purification. She drank from the sacred Cassotis spring, chewed laurel leaves, and burned barley on the altar. Then, dressed in white, she entered the Aditon, the hidden chamber beneath the temple. There, seated on the tripod above the fissures, she inhaled the rising vapours. Witnesses described her breathing quickening, her eyes glazing, her voice breaking into frenzied utterances. To the uninitiated, it was terrifying. To the faithful, it was the god descending into her body. Her words did not come as neat sentences. They poured out in fragments, shouts, whispers, incomprehensible syllables. The temple priests, trained in interpretation, stood nearby, shaping her speech into poetic form, often hexameter verse. These verses were then delivered to the waiting petitioner as Apollo's answer. The ritual was as important as the prophecy itself. It gave weight to every word, surrounding it with mystery. Those who left Delphi rarely doubted that they had heard the voice of a god. The oracle's riddles were not simple messages. They were sacred experiences, binding men and women alike to Apollo's eternal will. If Delphi was the navel of the world, then the oracle was its heartbeat during war. No major campaign, no ambitious expansion, and often no treaty was sealed without her voice. City-states looked to her not just for divine approval, but for reassurance that their cause was fated to succeed. In a world where the gods were believed to decide every outcome, to march into battle without Apollo's sanction seemed reckless, even suicidal. One of the most famous examples came during the Persian Wars of the 5th century BCE. When the mighty Persian army advanced on Greece, envoys from Athens climbed Mount Parnassus, seeking guidance. The oracle's first words were bleak. She warned them that fire and destruction would consume the city, that only a wall of wood would save them. The Athenians were thrown into confusion. What wall of wood could resist the vast Persian horde? Interpretations varied. Some believed it meant fortifications on land. Others argued it referred to ships. Ultimately, Themistocles, one of Athens' sharpest minds, insisted the oracle meant their navy. He convinced his people to abandon the city, take to the sea, and fight at Salamis. The result was a stunning Greek victory that changed the course of history. Without the oracle's riddle and Themistocles' bold reading of it, Greece might have fallen. Sparta too sought her voice before decisive battles. It was said the oracle foretold that either Sparta would be destroyed or one of its kings must die before the Persians could be defeated. Leonidas marched to Thermopylae with this prophecy in mind, knowing his sacrifice would fulfill Apollo's decree. His last stand became legend, and the oracle's words were woven into the mythology of Greek heroism. The oracle's power did not stop at warfare. Politicians sought her advice on laws, colonists consulted her before founding new cities, and alliances were made or broken depending on her approval. Rivals accused each other of bribing the priests, yet even in suspicion, her authority remained untouched. She was too entrenched, too divine to be ignored. In many ways, the Oracle of Delphi was the invisible participant in every major Greek decision. She did not wield a sword or a shield, but her words were as decisive as any army. Through ambiguity and riddles, she held sway over kings and councils alike, steering the course of politics with the subtle weight of prophecy. The Oracle of Delphi was not only consulted by kings and generals, she also became a guiding light for thinkers, poets, and ordinary men and women searching for answers to life's deepest questions. Her temple was not just a place of strategy, it was a place of philosophy, a crossroads where divine riddles collided with human curiosity. Among the most famous stories was that of Socrates. According to tradition, his friend Chaerephon once asked the oracle if there was anyone wiser than Socrates. The answer came back clear. None was wiser. When Socrates heard this, he was baffled. He claimed to know nothing. Yet in this paradox, he found the path that defined his life. True wisdom lay in recognizing one's ignorance. The oracle's words set him on a journey of questioning and dialogue that became the foundation of Western philosophy. A single prophecy reshaped the course of thought for centuries, but the oracle's wisdom reached beyond philosophy. Ordinary people came to her with questions of family, love, health, and morality. Should a farmer plant this year or wait for the rains? Should a sailor risk the sea or remain ashore? Should a woman accept a marriage offer or refuse it? These were not questions of empires, but of survival, dignity, and happiness. The Pythia answered them all, her riddles shaping the lives of individuals just as much as the fate of nations. The temple itself reinforced this atmosphere of moral reflection. Carved into its stones were maxims that still echo today. Know thyself, and nothing in excess. These simple phrases, tied forever to Delphi, became ethical cornerstones of Greek culture. Visitors left not only with prophecy, but with reminders of restraint, humility, and balance. Artists and poets also sought the oracle's guidance, inspired by her riddles to create plays, poems, and myths that carried her voice beyond the sacred precinct. Her influence bled into Greek theatre, literature, and even architecture, where the sense of mystery and grandeur surrounding Delphi inspired countless works. For over 1,000 years, the oracle stood as a source of wisdom in both the public and private spheres. She was at once a counselor to kings and a confidant to commoners. To sit before her tripod was to stand before the unknown itself, and whether you were a philosopher pondering truth or a farmer fearing failure, the oracle's words carried the same weight. Destiny itself whispered through her lips. By the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, Delphi was no longer just a sanctuary. It had become the spiritual and political crossroads of the Greek world. City-states that feuded endlessly still agreed on one thing: the oracle's voice was supreme. To stand in Apollo's temple was to stand at the center of Hellenic identity, where politics, religion, and culture intertwined. The sacred way that led to the temple became a dazzling display of wealth and rivalry. As Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes competed for dominance, They built treasuries along the path to house their offerings, gleaming marble buildings filled with gold, silver, and statues. Each city-state sought to outshine the others, not only to honor Apollo, but also to showcase their own power to every pilgrim who passed through Delphi. Walking that path was like strolling through a miniature Greece, each monument a statement of pride and prestige. Delphi's festivals further amplified its fame. Chief among them were the Pythian Games, held every 4 years in honor of Apollo's victory over the serpent Python. These games rivaled even the Olympics, drawing athletes, musicians, and poets from across the Mediterranean. Victors returned home crowned with laurel wreaths, symbols of Apollo's favor. The blending of athleticism, art, and religion at Delphi turned the site into a hub of pan-Hellenic unity, even as rivalries simmered elsewhere. Foreign rulers, too, recognized Delphi's power. Envoys from Egypt, Lydia, and even distant Rome made offerings at the temple. For them, the oracle was not merely a Greek phenomenon. She was a universal voice, a bridge between cultures. When powerful leaders sought legitimacy, they often turned to Delphi, for a favorable prophecy could strengthen their rule just as surely as an army. At its height, Delphi was more than a sanctuary. It was a stage where the drama of the ancient world unfolded. The oracle sat at the center, her riddles rippling outward to shape politics, philosophy, and culture. The priests maintained order, interpreting her words, recording dedications, and ensuring the temple remained neutral ground. In an age of endless war, Delphi stood as the one place where all Greeks, no matter their city, bowed to the same authority. The height of Delphi's fame was also the height of the oracle's power. Her voice carried not only through the mountains of Greece, but across the known world. To seek her counsel was to seek destiny itself, and for centuries, destiny seemed to reside within Apollo's temple. Great powers rise, and even sacred voices fade. By the time Rome conquered Greece in the 2nd century BCE, Delphi had already begun its long decline. Though the Romans admired Greek culture and often honored its gods, the oracle no longer carried the same unquestioned authority she once had over the Greek world. Rome was vast, its empire stretching across continents, and the voices of many religions competed within its borders. Still, Roman generals and emperors occasionally made the pilgrimage to Delphi, seeking Apollo's guidance as Greek kings once had. Nero even plundered treasures from the sanctuary, a sign that reverence was giving way to exploitation. The Pythia still gave prophecies, but their scope was narrower. Rome had its own augurs, haruspices, and oracles scattered throughout the empire. What was once the singular voice of destiny became one among many. Yet even in diminished importance, the oracle retained an aura of ancient mystery, and many Romans respected her for it. The empire may have eclipsed Greece, but the old traditions refused to die quietly. The real breaking point came with the rise of Christianity. As the new faith spread, it clashed directly with the pagan world. Early Christian leaders saw the oracle as dangerous, a voice not of a god, but of demons. Her influence was chipped away as Christian bishops condemned her rituals and her prophecies. Still, the oracle endured for centuries after Christ's birth, lingering like a shadow of an older age. One famous story tells of the Emperor Julian, known as the Apostate, for his attempts to revive paganism in the 4th century CE. He sent to Delphi, asking for a prophecy to guide his mission. The oracle's reply was grim. "Tell the king, the fair-built hall has fallen. Apollo has no dwelling, nor a prophetic laurel, nor a speaking spring. The voice is stilled." With those words, it was as if Apollo himself had announced his departure. The sacred vapours fell silent, the temple crumbled, and the Pythia's seat remained empty. What had once been the navel of the world was reduced to ruins, its stones scattered, its treasuries looted. The Oracle of Delphi, who for centuries had shaped the fate of kings and philosophers alike, was no more. The age of prophecy had ended, and a new world, dominated by the Christian Church, had begun. Though the Oracle of Delphi fell silent more than 1600 years ago, her voice continues to echo through history. Her temple may lie in ruins, but the power she once wielded is preserved in myth, literature, and philosophy. Few women in the ancient world held such authority, and fewer still shaped the destinies of nations. Even in decline, the memory of the Pythia inspired awe, for she had embodied the bridge between mortals and the divine. Her influence on philosophy remains profound. Socrates' entire method of inquiry, his relentless questioning, his embrace of humility before truth, was sparked by a single Delphic prophecy. The moral inscriptions carved into the stones of Apollo's temple, "Know thyself, and nothing in excess," became guiding principles not only for Greeks, but for later cultures that inherited their wisdom. Through these words, the oracle's voice lived on, long after the fumes and rituals faded. In literature, the oracle became a symbol of mystery and fate. Tragedians like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides wove her prophecies into their plays, using her riddles to remind audiences of the inevitability of destiny. In Oedipus Rex, it was her prophecy that drove the doomed king to try, and fail, to escape his fate. Even when unseen on stage, the oracle's presence loomed large, shaping drama itself. Her influence reached beyond Greece. Romans, Renaissance scholars, and even modern writers looked back to Delphi as a place where human ambition met divine enigma. For Christians, she became a cautionary tale of paganism's decline. For humanists, she was a reminder of the ancient world's thirst for wisdom. In many ways, the oracle became more powerful in memory than she had ever been in life. Today, visitors walk among the ruins of Delphi, the broken columns and toppled stones, whispering of a world where gods and men once conversed. Though the tripod is gone and the sacred vapours have vanished, the aura of mystery remains. Tourists, historians, and dreamers alike climb Mount Parnassus to stand where kings once knelt, imagining the trembling voice of a woman speaking in riddles. The Oracle of Delphi may no longer prophesy, but her legacy endures in philosophy, in literature, and in the timeless human desire to seek meaning from the unknown. She reminds us that even in silence, some voices never truly fade. For the Roman soldier, the day did not end when the march was over. In fact, the hardest part often began only after the horn signalled the halt. A legion might cover 15 to 20 miles in a single day, trudging under the Mediterranean sun, or through the mud of northern Europe. Each man carried not just his armour and weapons, but also a heavy pack loaded with stakes for palisades, tools for digging, cooking gear, and personal rations. The Romans called these men muli Mariani, Marius's mules, a testament to how much they hauled on their backs. As the column slowed, discipline never wavered. This was not a chaotic sprawl of tired men dropping where they stood. Every soldier knew that their survival depended on order, and order began with the camp. For the Romans, safety came not from chance, but from routine. A legion without walls was exposed, vulnerable to ambush, thieves, or sudden attack. But a legion that built its own fortress each night could rest behind ramparts as secure as any permanent city. When the general chose the moment to stop, his surveyors stepped forward. They carried measuring rods and flags, marking out the precise footprint of the camp. To an outsider, it might have looked like a small miracle. An empty field was suddenly transformed into the outline of a fortress. Lines were drawn for the main streets, for the commander's tent, for the storage of supplies, and for the positions of the cohorts. Every man would know exactly where he belonged before the first shovel struck earth. The work ahead was grueling, but it was also familiar. Soldiers found comfort in repetition. Whether in Spain, Gaul, Africa, or the wild forests of Germania, the process was always the same. The rhythm of construction gave the legion a sense of stability, even in hostile territory. A soldier could look at the newly marked ground and already imagine the protective walls, the glowing fires, and the ordered rows of tents that would rise before nightfall. For the Romans, the march did not end with arrival. The true measure of discipline lay in what came next, turning wilderness into fortress, exhaustion into security, and a patch of foreign soil into Rome itself. The success of a Roman camp began long before the first shovel struck the earth. The general and his officers treated the choice of ground as a matter of life and death, because often it was. A poorly chosen site could mean thirst, disease, or a nighttime ambush. A well-chosen one could turn a weary legion into an unbreakable fortress. The surveyors, specialists known as metators, were the first to move forward once the marching column halted. Carrying staffs, measuring rods, and brightly coloured flags, they spread out across the terrain. Their eyes searched for specific qualities. The ground needed to be firm and elevated, never in a swamp or valley where rainwater might collect. A camp on a hill not only stayed dry, but also gave the soldiers a vantage point to watch for enemy movement. At the same time, the location needed access to fresh water, streams, springs, or rivers, without exposing the camp to flooding. Firewood, too, was considered, for without it, cooking and warmth became impossible. But security was always the top priority. An open field allowed for clear lines of sight, making it harder for enemies to sneak close under cover. If hostile forces were nearby, the chosen ground was sometimes deliberately placed to show strength, projecting Roman confidence. The message was simple: here we stand, and we are ready. Once the site was approved, the metators planted their flags, marking the outline of the camp. This was not done haphazardly. It followed a precise formula. The camp was a square or rectangle, its sides aligned with the cardinal points of the compass. Within moments, the blank landscape was transformed into an invisible blueprint. Soldiers who had never seen this particular field before already knew where their tents would stand, where the gates would open, and where the commander's quarters would rise. This methodical choice of ground was a reflection of Roman discipline itself. Where other armies might scatter in exhaustion, the legions imposed order on chaos. Every patch of earth they touched became part of a greater system. The chosen ground was not just a resting place, it was the foundation for survival and for the projection of Roman power deep into foreign lands. Once the site was marked out with flags, the quiet of the chosen field quickly gave way to the clatter of tools. Every soldier knew what came next. Digging. There was no waiting, no pause to rest aching legs. The legion's security depended on the speed with which they could transform open ground into a defensible fortress. The first task was the ditch, the fossa. Soldiers lined up along the perimeter, each man wielding a mattock or spade. Soil flew as they cut into the earth, heaving dirt into wicker baskets that others carried away. The ditch was not shallow. Depending on the situation, it could be as deep as 9 feet and just as wide, steep enough to make a sudden charge nearly impossible. Even if enemies tried to rush the camp in the night, they would find themselves scrambling at the bottom of a trench, easy targets for Roman javelins raining down from above. The earth dug from the ditch did not go to waste. It was piled inward to form the agger, a raised embankment that added height and strength to the defences. Into this embankment, soldiers drove sharpened stakes, the pila muralia they carried in their packs. When lined up together, these created a sturdy palisade, a bristling wall of wood that crowned the earthen rampart. The combined effect of ditch, mound, and palisade turned the once open field into a formidable obstacle within hours. Speed was everything. Roman commanders expected a full camp, ditches, ramparts, and palisades in place before nightfall, no matter how far the army had marched. The discipline behind this routine was unmatched in antiquity. Other armies might collapse in exhaustion, leaving themselves exposed, but the Romans understood that fatigue was a lesser enemy than surprise. Their walls gave them not only safety, but also peace of mind. Allowing soldiers to sleep knowing they were protected, the sound of construction became a familiar rhythm. Shovels striking earth, stakes hammered into place, orders shouted by centurions. What might have seemed like a back-breaking chore to outsiders was, for the legionary, as natural as sharpening a sword. By nightfall, where there had been nothing, there now stood a fortress. Trenches dug, walls raised, and the outline of a Roman city taking shape. The transformation was so swift, so methodical, that enemies often marveled at how an entire army could vanish into a fortified stronghold in the span of a single evening. With the defences rising around them, the Romans turned inward to shape the heart of the camp. To a casual observer, the inside might have looked like chaos at first. Hundreds of soldiers, pack animals and carts pouring through the gates. But within moments, the order of Rome asserted itself. The Castra was not a collection of tents thrown together at random. It was a city in miniature, designed with mathematical precision. At the very centre of the camp was the praetorium, the commander's tent. This was no ordinary shelter. Large, spacious, and commanding, it symbolised the authority of the general and acted as the nerve centre for the entire legion. Around it stretched an open space called the Forum, where standards were planted and announcements made. Here, soldiers gathered for speeches, punishments, or the distribution of supplies. Two main roads cut across the camp, the Via Praetoria, leading from the main gate to the commander's tent, and the Via Principalis, crossing it at a right angle. These streets gave the camp a spine of order, dividing it into sections much like a Roman town. Smaller lanes branched off to connect rows of tents, ensuring that every man knew where to find his place. The soldiers' quarters lined the grid in neat rows. Each contubernium, a group of 8 soldiers, shared a leather tent, their gear stacked neatly inside. Behind them, a shallow trench was dug to drain rainwater away, keeping their temporary homes dry. Larger spaces were reserved for the cavalry and artillery, whose equipment required more room. Nearby, storage areas held food, weapons, and spare supplies, carefully guarded and inventoried. Special sections were set aside for craftsmen, cooks, and medics. The camp even had designated areas for latrines, dug deep to reduce the spread of disease. An early example of Roman practicality. Animals, too, had their space, stabled near the gates so they could be brought out quickly when needed. Nothing was left to chance. Every cohort, every officer, every servant had a precise place marked in the invisible blueprint laid out by the surveyors. The effect was astonishing. By nightfall, what had been empty ground in the afternoon was now a walled city with streets, squares, and neighbourhoods. To the legionary, this order was more than convenience. It was reassurance. No matter how far they marched, or how strange the land, they could always walk into camp and feel at home. As the sun dipped behind the hills and the campfires began to glow, the Roman camp did not sink into silence. Discipline demanded that the Castra remain as vigilant at night as it was busy during the day. Behind the safety of ditches and palisades, order continued, organised, deliberate, and relentless. The first task of the evening was setting the guard. Each cohort drew lots to determine which men would serve as sentries during the night. No one was exempt. Every soldier eventually faced his turn on the perimeter. To neglect this duty was unthinkable. A guard who fell asleep at his post could doom the entire legion. The punishment was brutal. Death, often by being clubbed to death by his fellow soldiers. It was a grim reminder that the safety of thousands depended on the vigilance of a few. The watch was divided into shifts, or vigiliae, each lasting about 3 hours. Trumpet blasts signalled the changing of the guard, ensuring that every soldier knew when his time had come. The sentries took their positions along the ramparts, at the gates, and in the watchtowers built from timber. Their eyes scanned the darkness for any sign of movement, ears tuned for the faintest rustle. To be a Roman sentry was to live suspended between exhaustion and alertness, knowing that enemies might strike at any hour. Inside the camp, order was just as strict. The main gates were locked and secured. Patrols moved silently through the streets, checking that no one strayed where they did not belong. Fires were kept controlled, their light carefully managed so as not to reveal too much to outsiders. Even in rest, the Romans sought discipline. No drunken chaos, no disorderly noise, just the low murmur of men eating, sharpening weapons, or whispering before sleep. The general, too, did not rest in idleness. He and his officers might meet in the praetorium, reviewing the day's march, planning tomorrow's route, or considering intelligence of enemy movement. The camp was not only a fortress, it was a command center, humming with quiet but purposeful activity. To an enemy approaching in the dark, the Castra was a daunting sight. Ramparts bristling with stakes, shadows of watchmen pacing, the glow of countless fires behind fortified walls. It was a reminder that the Romans did not simply camp, they created security itself. The night was theirs because vigilance never slept. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the Roman camp stirred to life with the same discipline that had shaped its creation the night before. A trumpet's sharp call broke the silence, signalling that the new day had begun. For the legionary, there was no slow awakening, no lazy stretching around the fire. The camp moved like a living machine, each man trained to perform his part without hesitation. The first order of business was inspection. Centurions walked the rows, ensuring their men were awake, properly equipped, and ready for orders. Weapons were checked, shields polished, and armor secured. Discipline was drilled into every action. A soldier who neglected his gear was as dangerous to his comrades as an enemy blade. Even the smallest lapse could be punished harshly, for in the Roman army, standards were the glue that held everything together. Breakfast followed quickly, usually a simple meal of grain porridge, bread, and perhaps a piece of cheese or dried meat. Soldiers cooked in small groups, sharing food within their contubernium, the tight-knit unit of 8 men who lived and fought side by side. The meal was practical, not leisurely. Fuel for the day ahead, nothing more. After eating, came the signal for drills and orders. If the legion was to remain in camp, the morning would be filled with training. Soldiers practiced marching in formation, throwing their javelins, or sparring with wooden swords weighted heavier than the real thing to build strength. Engineers checked siege equipment, while craftsmen repaired armor and tools. If the army was preparing to march, however, the focus shifted. Tents were struck, gear was packed, and the camp was readied for dismantling. The general and his officers gathered in the praetorium to deliver commands. Plans for the day's march, potential routes, or battle preparations were announced. Trumpeters carried these signals across the camp, their blasts echoing through the morning air. To the outside world, this might have seemed like the clamour of chaos, but to the Roman soldier, it was music, an orchestra of order. The dawn routine set the tone for the day. Whether training, building, or marching, the legion began with precision, unity, and discipline. In this way, the Roman camp was not just a fortress of wood and earth, but a fortress of routine, one that moulded men into the most effective fighting force of the ancient world. When the order came to move, the Roman camp vanished almost as swiftly as it had appeared. What had been a bustling fortress at dusk was by dawn already in the process of being dismantled, each man performing his role with practiced efficiency. For the legionary, this was routine, another chapter in the endless rhythm of march, build, defend, dismantle, and march again. The first step was striking the tents. Each contubernium worked together, carefully folding the heavy leather sheets and packing poles and ropes. Nothing was left behind. Discipline demanded that the camp's footprint vanish with the army. Fires were doused, ashes scattered, and trenches filled in. The ground might still bear scars of digging, but to an approaching enemy, the Romans left little of use. Next came the palisades. The wooden stakes that had bristled along the ramparts the night before were pulled from the earth, cleaned and bundled. Each soldier carried a share, just as he had carried them the day before. These stakes, along with shovels and tools, were as vital to the legion as swords and shields. Without them, the army would be naked at night. Roman strength lay not only in its weapons, but in its ability to create fortresses wherever it went. Supplies were loaded onto wagons and pack animals. The quartermasters oversaw the process with strict attention, ensuring that food, weapons, and equipment were balanced across the baggage train. Order of march was carefully arranged. Scouts and cavalry led the way, followed by engineers, then the legions in disciplined columns. The baggage train and camp followers travelled in the middle, protected by soldiers on all sides, while rear guards kept watch against ambush. Before leaving, officers inspected the site one final time. Nothing of value was to fall into enemy hands. Even waste was buried, partly for sanitation, partly to deny enemies the chance to track the legion by its refuse. The Romans moved like a tide, sweeping in, reshaping the land, and then receding, leaving little more than memory. When the trumpet sounded, the legionaries hoisted their packs and fell into formation. The camp that had been their home, their fortress, and their protection disappeared behind them. Ahead lay another day's march, and by nightfall, another field would be transformed into Rome. The cycle continued, as endless and disciplined as the empire itself. Though the nightly camp routine was a cornerstone of Roman discipline, not every situation followed the same script. The legions were nothing if not adaptable, and special circumstances often forced them to adjust their castra to suit the demands of terrain, season, or strategy. One such circumstance was the winter camp, the hiberna. Unlike the temporary fortresses built each evening, the hiberna were meant to last for months. Constructed in colder regions like Germania or Britannia, these camps had more permanent features. Huts of timber and stone replaced leather tents. Deeper ditches and stronger walls were dug, and granaries were built to store the season's supplies. These camps became small towns in their own right, complete with workshops, stables, and even bathhouses, reminders that Roman comfort could be carved into the harshest frontier. During sieges, the camp took on a different form entirely. If a legion encircled a city or fortress, it would build not just one camp, but often a ring of them, connected by ditches and walls that both protected the Romans and hemmed in their enemies. These camps might last weeks or months, sometimes longer than the city under siege itself. Here, engineering genius came to the fore. Towers, siege ramps, and supply depots were integrated into the camp's design, turning it into a vast war machine bristling with intent. Emergencies called for another layer of adaptation. If a sudden threat loomed, the legions could raise a camp in astonishing speed, sometimes in less than 2 hours. In these cases, the ditch might be shallower and the palisade rougher, but the principle remained the same. Never rest without defences. Even under ambush, Roman soldiers instinctively sought to impose order on chaos, creating barriers with wagons, stakes, or anything at hand until the full castra could be built. Geography, too, demanded flexibility. In rocky terrain where ditches could not be dug, walls of piled stone substituted. In deserts, water sources dictated layout, and tents clustered tightly around wells. Wherever they went, the Romans reshaped the land to suit their needs, but always within the disciplined framework of the castra. These adaptations proved the genius of Roman military culture. The camp was not a rigid formula, but a living system, able to flex under pressure without breaking. Whether in winter cold, siege warfare, or sudden danger, the Romans always built their fortress. To them, safety was not luck. It was labour, discipline, and the certainty of routine. The Roman camp was more than a nightly fortress. It was a statement of power, order, and identity. Wherever the legions marched, they carried Rome itself into foreign lands. The castra was not simply a place to rest. It was the embodiment of Roman discipline, repeated so often that it became second nature to every soldier. And when the empire expanded, the traces of these temporary fortresses became permanent marks on history. Many Roman towns and cities began as camps. The grid layout of streets in places like Cologne, Vienna, and Chester can still be traced back to the design of a legionary castra. What was once the Via Praetoria became a main thoroughfare. The Praetorium evolved into a civic centre, and the regular rows of tents turned into city blocks. In this way, the Roman way of war left behind not only ruins of walls and forts, but entire urban landscapes. The legacy of the camp also shaped military thinking for centuries to come. Medieval armies, though far less disciplined, often imitated aspects of Roman encampments, raising palisades and digging ditches whenever possible. Even in modern military practice, the principle of securing a defensible base before rest echoes the lessons of the Roman castra. Safety through preparation remains a universal law of war, but the true genius of the castra lay in what it revealed about the Roman mind. It was not enough to fight bravely or win battles. To be Roman was to impose order, to turn wilderness into structure, and to never allow chance to dictate survival. Every ditch dug, every stake driven, and every street marked in the dust was an act of civilization as much as an act of war. For the legionary, the camp routine was tedious, backbreaking, and relentless. Yet it was also the foundation of his security. Behind those walls he could eat, sleep, and prepare for the next day's march. In the long years of campaigning, the Castra became as familiar as his shield, a constant reminder that wherever he went, Rome went with him. Today, archaeologists still uncover the outlines of these temporary cities. Faint ditches, remnants of stakes, and the telltale grids carved into the earth. They are silent testimonies to a discipline so ingrained that it built empires and left traces lasting 2,000 years. The Roman camp was never just routine, it was Rome itself, rebuilt each night and carried into eternity. The life of a Roman recruit usually began far from the battlefield. Most of the men who would one day march beneath the legionary standards were ordinary youths drawn from the soil of Italy or the provinces. Some came from quiet farms, where they had spent their lives behind a plough, hardened by work, but untouched by the discipline of military order. Others came from the bustling city streets of Rome itself, where poverty was common, and the lure of steady pay and the promise of bread and coin tempted many to enlist. For the poor farmer, enlistment meant relief from endless toil with little reward. A soldier's pay, though modest, was guaranteed, and the promise of spoils after campaigns made the risk seem worth it. For the city boy, the army offered a path out of hunger and obscurity. The legions gave structure, food, clothing, and even the possibility of land after years of service. For some, it was less about ambition and more about survival. Yet whether drawn by desperation or adventure, once they stood before the recruiter there was no turning back. The selection process was stern. Examiners checked their bodies carefully. Broad chests, strong arms, sturdy legs were all sought after. Teeth were examined to judge health. Scars or deformities were scrutinized as signs of weakness. Rome demanded not just willingness, but physical endurance. Those who passed were branded as suitable, their lives now bound to the legions. The moment of transformation came with the sacramentum, the military oath. Standing with others who had been chosen, the recruit swore absolute loyalty to his commanders, to his comrades, and above all to Rome. He promised never to desert, never to refuse orders, and to endure all hardship for the glory of the empire. Breaking that oath meant death, not just for treason against men, but for betrayal of the gods who watched over Rome. From that moment on, he ceased to belong to his family, village, or city. His life was no longer his own. It was Rome's. Whether he had come barefoot from a farm or ragged from the streets, he was now part of something greater, stepping onto a path that would test his strength, his will, and his very identity. The boy who had arrived as a peasant or pauper was now a recruit, standing at the threshold of becoming a Roman soldier. The recruit's first true step into the legion was not the issue of weapons, but the swearing of the oath, the sacramentum. This was no casual promise. It was a sacred vow before the gods, binding the soldier to absolute loyalty. Standing among dozens of others, he raised his right hand and pledged to obey orders without question, to never desert, and to place Rome above his own life. In that moment, he was no longer just a man. He became the property of the state. To break the oath was not only a crime, but a kind of blasphemy, punishable by death. The seriousness of it set the tone for everything that would follow. After the oath, the recruit was introduced to his new identity through clothing and equipment. At first, he did not receive the polished armor and gleaming helmets we imagine from Roman statues. Those were earned. Instead, the young recruit was issued the basics: a simple tunic, heavy hobnailed sandals called caligae, and a belt that marked him as a soldier. This belt, often decorated with metal fittings, was more than practical. It was a visible badge of his new life. a reminder that he was no longer free to wander as he pleased. The uniform was not about comfort. The sandals were sturdy but unforgiving, designed for endless marching across dirt roads and rocky ground. The tunic was plain and rough, built for durability, not appearance. The recruit might have looked far from the image of a seasoned veteran, but that was the point. Rome stripped away his old identity and replaced it with one rooted in uniformity. From this moment onward, he was indistinguishable from his fellows, just another cog in the great machine of the Legion. Weapons, too, were issued, but not the gleaming steel of legend. At first, he was handed weighted wooden swords and javelins, heavier than the real thing. This was a deliberate cruelty, designed to make training harder than battle. His hands blistered, his shoulders ached, but in time, his body adapted. By the time he held real weapons, they would feel light in comparison. Clothed, armed, and bound by oath, the recruit was reborn. He was no longer farmer or city dweller. He was a legionary in training, ready to be broken down by discipline and built back up as part of Rome's most feared force. The transformation had only just begun. If the oath and uniform stripped a recruit of his old life, training stripped him of his softness. From the moment he entered the training grounds, the true purpose of Rome's discipline revealed itself: to break ordinary men and rebuild them as warriors of iron. There were no shortcuts. A recruit who could not endure would be cast out, humiliated, or left behind. The first lessons were not about glorious charges or heroic combat. They were about standing, marching, and obeying without hesitation. Drill masters barked commands until every recruit could move in perfect unison, turning, halting, and advancing as though part of a single body. To stumble was to be struck. To disobey was to be punished. The Legion thrived not on individual skill, but on collective precision. Weapons training came next, though not with steel. The recruits were handed wooden swords, rudis, and wooden javelins, pila, each made deliberately heavier than the real thing. Day after day, they hacked at wooden posts set in the ground, striking again and again until their arms burned and their shoulders screamed with pain. A recruit who thought he was strong soon learned that Rome demanded more. When at last he was allowed to hold a real sword or spear, it felt almost weightless, a reward for his suffering. Marching was another torment. Recruits were driven on forced marches carrying full packs, up to 90 pounds of gear, sometimes covering 20 miles in a single day. Roads, fields, hills, it made no difference. The Legion had to move like a machine, and every recruit had to prove he could keep pace. Fall behind, and the punishment was as brutal as the march itself. Physical conditioning never ended. Running, swimming, digging trenches, and building camps were all part of daily life. Wrestling and mock battles toughened their bodies and sharpened their reflexes. Even the simplest tasks, lifting, carrying, stacking, were drilled into them until every movement became instinct. Discipline was harsher still. Laziness, drunkenness, or cowardice was met with public humiliation or savage punishment. Rome believed that fear was as important a teacher as hunger or fatigue. A recruit learned quickly that pain came not just from the enemy, but from within his own ranks if he failed. The brutal training regime was relentless, but it worked. By the end, the boy who had once wielded a plough or loafed in the streets was gone. In his place stood a man forged in hardship, a soldier ready to fight, not as an individual, but as a part of Rome's indestructible war machine. If training hardened the body, discipline hardened the spirit. For the Roman recruit, punishment was not an occasional threat. It was the foundation of military life. The army demanded absolute obedience, and every man quickly learned that failure to obey meant pain, shame, or even death. The smallest offences brought swift correction. Arriving late for roll call, mishandling a weapon, or failing to keep armour polished could mean beatings with sticks or whips. A soldier might be ordered to carry double rations of grain, dig extra ditches, or stand guard without rest. These punishments were not just about the individual. They reminded everyone else that mistakes were intolerable. The legion was a machine, and a weak cog endangered the whole. But when offences grew serious, punishments became terrifying. Cowardice in battle, disobedience in the field, or theft from comrades were considered crimes against the legion itself. One of the most dreaded punishments was fustuarium, death by clubbing, often carried out by the offender's own comrades. It was brutal, but it reinforced the message. The legion was sacred, and no man could endanger it without paying the ultimate price. The most infamous punishment was decimation. If a unit collectively disgraced itself by mutiny, desertion, or disgraceful retreat, the entire group was lined up, and 1 in every 10 men was chosen by lot to be executed by their fellows. The survivors, bloodied and shaken, carried the memory forever. Decimation was rare, but the fear of it haunted every soldier, ensuring loyalty not only to commanders but to each other. Discipline extended even to daily routines. Recruits were taught to maintain spotless equipment, to obey orders instantly, and to never question the chain of command. Centurions, the backbone of Roman discipline, enforced this with unflinching severity. They carried vites, vine staves, as symbols of authority, and were quick to use them on the backs of slackers. To the modern eye it may seem cruel, but to the Romans it was the price of survival. Through this iron system, the legion created men who did not simply fight, they endured. A recruit learned that pain, hunger, and fatigue were temporary, but dishonour was permanent. By suffering together and enduring together, recruits were forged into soldiers who valued discipline above life itself. Rome's strength lay not only in its weapons or tactics, but in this culture of unyielding order. Life as a Roman recruit was not all drills and punishments, though it often felt that way. Each day was carved into strict routines, a rhythm designed to leave no room for idleness, no chance for weakness to grow. The army was as much a school of discipline as it was a school of war, and every hour of a recruit's life was accounted for. The day began at dawn with the blare of a trumpet. Recruits rolled out of their tents, tightened their belts, and assembled in formation for inspection. Centurions paced the lines, scanning for unpolished armour, loose straps, or sluggish movements. Even before breakfast, discipline was enforced. A recruit learned quickly that appearances mattered. Order and readiness were the army's first weapons. After inspection came a simple meal, bread, porridge, or dried rations eaten with fellow contubernales, the small band of 8 men who shared a tent and lived as a family unit. These bonds were vital, for each man's survival depended on the reliability of the others. Once the meal was finished, the real work of the day began. Morning hours were usually reserved for weapons training. Recruits practiced with their heavy wooden swords and javelins, striking posts until their muscles ached. Others drilled in formation, marching in step, executing turns, and learning to respond instantly to shouted commands or trumpet blasts. Endurance exercises followed, running, swimming, and wrestling to toughen the body. Sweat was constant, blisters inevitable, but there was no pity. Afternoons were often devoted to labour. Recruits dug ditches, cut timber, carried stones, and built practice camps. These tasks were not only training but preparation. A soldier needed to be as skilled with a shovel as with a sword, for Rome's strength lay as much in her fortified camps as in her battle lines. Evening brought another meal, followed by lighter duties, cleaning weapons, repairing equipment, or standing guard shifts. The camp quieted under watchful eyes, but recruits rarely enjoyed leisure. Even when not ordered to labour, they knew that any lapse could be punished. By nightfall, the day's rhythm left the recruits exhausted but stronger. Every sunrise began the cycle again. Inspection, training, labour, discipline. The routine was relentless, but its purpose was clear. By stripping away comfort and enforcing order, Rome reshaped raw youths into hardened legionaries who could march, fight, and endure without hesitation. A Roman recruit was not trained to be a lone warrior. He was trained to be part of something larger, a machine of flesh and iron known as the Legion. Individual bravery was valued, but discipline, unity, and loyalty to comrades mattered far more. From his first day, every lesson pressed this truth into the recruit's mind. Survival depended on the man beside him. The smallest unit of the Legion was the Contubernium, a tent group of 8 men who shared food, shelter, and responsibility. For the recruit, this became his family. They trained together, marched together, built camps together, and often shared punishments together. Trust was forged through sweat and suffering. If one man faltered on a march, the others bore his burden. If one man shirked duty, all paid the price. Through this, the recruit learned that his actions were never his alone. Above the Contubernium stood the century of 80 men, led by a centurion whose authority was absolute. The centurion embodied the spirit of Rome's discipline. To recruits, he was both a teacher and a terror, driving them to perfection with relentless drills and the sting of his vine staff. Yet over time, respect grew. The centurion shared their hardships, marched at their side, and stood in the front line of battle. His presence reminded recruits that leadership in Rome was earned by endurance as much as command. The recruit also absorbed the symbols of the Legion. The eagle standard, carried at the heart of the unit, was more than metal on a pole. It was the soul of Rome itself. To lose it in battle was the ultimate disgrace. Recruits were taught to fight not just for their lives, but for the honor of the eagle and the eternal glory of the Legion. Camaraderie was fostered in other ways as well. Meals were communal, tasks were shared, victories celebrated together. Festivals, sacrifices to the gods, and even the daily routines of singing on the march or setting camp built bonds stronger than family ties. These men were not just companions, they were brothers in arms, bound by the oath of loyalty and the shared grind of training. By the time training advanced, the recruit no longer thought of himself as a farmer's son or a city pauper. He was a legionary, part of a living wall of shields and spears. The legionary spirit had been hammered into him, a spirit that valued unity over self, Rome over all. Training camps hardened the body and forged discipline, but nothing compared to the shock of a recruit's first campaign. Once the oath was sworn and the drills completed, the recruit was sent marching with the Legion beyond the safety of familiar fields. For many, it was the first time leaving home. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and with it came exhaustion, fear, and the dawning realization that war was not glory. It was survival. The first lesson was the march itself. 20 miles a day with nearly 90 pounds of gear strapped across shoulders and hips tested even the strongest. The recruit's pack held stakes for building nightly camps, rations of grain, a cloak, cooking equipment, tools, and weapons. He quickly understood why veterans were called Marius's mules. The burden was as constant as the march. Feet blistered, muscles screamed, but the column moved on. Falling behind was not an option. Then came the reality of camp life on campaign. Each evening, after hours on the road, the exhausted recruits were ordered to dig ditches, raise ramparts, and drive palisade stakes. There was no collapse into rest until the fortress was built. To a recruit, it seemed cruel. To the Legion, it was safety. Under the stars of Gaul, Hispania, or Germania, the lesson was learned. Rome's power came from discipline, not comfort. But the hardest lessons came when the enemy appeared. The first clash was unforgettable. Trumpets blared, dust filled the air, and the recruit found himself shoulder to shoulder in a line of shields, heart pounding as missiles whistled overhead. Drills became instinct. Advance, throw the heavy javelin, lock shields, draw sword. Fear gripped every new soldier, but in the wall of men around him, courage took root. Casualties were inevitable. A recruit's first campaign was often his first taste of death. Comrades cut down beside him, screams echoing across the field. In those moments, he learned Rome's hardest truth. The Legion did not stop for grief. The formation closed ranks, and the march continued. Loss was endured, not indulged. By the end of his first campaign, the recruit was no longer untested. The marches, the camps, and the battles had burned away the softness of civilian life. He had felt fear, hunger, and exhaustion, and survived. Those who endured the first campaign were no longer recruits. They were legionaries, hardened by trial and bound to Rome by blood and sweat. By the time a recruit survived his first marches and battles, he was no longer wide-eyed, but he was still green. What truly shaped him into a Roman soldier was the time spent among veterans. These hardened men had years, sometimes decades, of service behind them. Their scars, both seen and unseen, told stories of campaigns stretching from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Germania. For the recruit, they were both mentors and relentless judges. Veterans wasted little time breaking in the newcomers. Around the campfires they taught practical survival skills that no drill master covered: how to pack gear so the weight chafed less, how to dry sodden cloaks over a fire without burning holes, how to spot the first signs of ambush in the rustle of trees. They passed down tricks for stretching rations, sharpening blades, and keeping feet from rotting after endless marches. A recruit who listened carefully might spare himself misery. A recruit who ignored them learned the hard way. But veterans also enforced the culture of the legion. They had little patience for complaints or softness. Newcomers were mocked for blisters, jeered for clumsy sword work, and scolded for slow reactions. It was harsh, but it was the Roman way. Pressure forged resilience. Over time, the recruit discovered that the ridicule faded as his competence grew. When a veteran finally nodded in respect, it meant more than any centurion's barked order. Living among veterans also meant absorbing their stories. Tales of past battles, heroic stands, near disasters, clever victories, circulated through the tents at night. These stories were not idle entertainment. They were lessons in courage, caution, and loyalty. The recruit learned that victory was never guaranteed, but discipline and unity gave Rome its edge. He also learned that death was an ever-present companion, accepted with grim humour. There was camaraderie too. Veterans taught songs sung on the march, crude jokes shared over rations, and rituals before battle. Slowly the recruit was no longer an outsider, but part of a brotherhood bound by shared hardship. Bonds of trust grew stronger than family ties, for in battle, each man's life depended on the one beside him. By living among veterans, the recruit crossed the final threshold from outsider to insider. He had entered as a raw youth, unsure and untested. Now he was learning to carry himself like a legionary, silent in suffering, steady in formation, and unshakable in loyalty. The transformation was nearly complete. At last, after months of grueling drills, bruising punishments, and the harsh schooling of campaign life, the recruit was no longer a recruit. He had been tested by hunger, fatigue, fear, and loss, and endured. What emerged was something Rome valued above all else: the disciplined legionary, a soldier forged in the fires of hardship. The transformation was both physical and mental. His once slender frame, softened by farm labour or city idleness, had become hardened muscle. Blisters on his feet had turned into calluses tough as leather. His arms no longer trembled under the weight of shield and sword. By now he could march 20 miles with full kit and still have the strength to dig a ditch or build a palisade at the end of the day. The endless repetition of drills had made every movement automatic. Throwing the pilum, raising the shield, thrusting the gladius, all without thought, as natural as breathing. Mentally, he had been reshaped by discipline. The fear that once gnawed at him before battle had been dulled, replaced by the calm knowledge that he was not alone. He stood as part of a wall of men, each shield locking with the next, each sword moving in rhythm. The recruit's old individuality had been stripped away, but in its place came something greater, the collective identity of the legion. He was no longer simply Marcus the farmer's son or Lucius the street urchin. He was a Roman soldier. Recognition of this new status often came in small ways. A centurion might finally address him without disdain. Veterans who once mocked his blunders now trusted him to hold the line. He received his full set of arms and armour: helmet, mail or segmented cuirass, shield emblazoned with the legion's mark. Clad in steel and carrying the eagle's honour on his shoulders, he looked every inch the image of Rome's might. The making of a legionary was never gentle. It was a process of breaking and rebuilding, of stripping away weakness until only iron remained. Yet the rewards were clear: steady pay, the prospect of land after service, and above all the pride of knowing he was part of the greatest military machine the world had ever seen. For Rome, the recruit's journey ensured that the legions remained unshakable. For the man himself, it marked the end of boyhood and the beginning of a life defined by loyalty, endurance, and the eternal march of empire.